Okay, hello everyone. So today I'll be presenting my paper on climate change economics, arguing for the integration of normativity into this discussion. So today we're exploring the fundamental question of should economists make recommendations regarding the optimal level of greenhouse gas emissions? This is sort of a brief outline. I will start off with my thesis and sort of laying out the premise of my argument. I essentially argue that economists should make greenhouse gas recommendations, but because of climate change's expansive and multidimensional nature, it's very difficult for economists to completely avoid making normative claims. I'll look at two specific theorists, Stern and Nordhaus, and I'll highlight how they make normative claims and how even in Nordhaus's efficiency-based solution, where he's trying to avoid making ethical assumptions, he still does so. Lastly, I'll sort of conclude the presentation with offering a solution to reconcile the issue of normativity within these frameworks. I argue that economists should make recommendations, and they can make recommendations that include normative claims, but they have to explicitly acknowledge what these assumptions are, and they have to acknowledge the analytical limitations of their moral reasoning. So, starting off, the nature of climate change is very interesting because, unlike other global issues, it is both transnational and intertemporal. The difficulty of climate change is one that there's so much risk and uncertainty associated with the issue. We are currently seeing a lot of changes in the environment that are because of climate change, and it's very difficult to predict what this might look like in the future. And a big challenge is that we have to balance present consumption with future damages. The sort of consequences of climate change are intra-generational, such that they are currently crossing borders and they're indiscriminately affecting people across the globe. Simultaneously, the compounding effects of greenhouse gas emissions into the Earth's atmosphere, as well as other environmental damage, but predominantly the greenhouse gas emissions, creates future damages that we can't even foresee. So therefore, in understanding climate change, given the amount of risk and given the amount of uncertainty, there are assumptions that we have to make, whether that is to prioritize present consumption or to give more weight to the future damages that could be caused. So I'll start off with Stern's utilitarian framework. And Stern uses a very low discount rate of 1.4%. And the way that he calculates this is that he uses an almost zero rate of social time preference. Basically, this means, and this is one of his normative assumptions, that the welfare of current generations is practically equal to the future welfare of people. And so he sort of accounts for a risk of extinction, but functionally speaking, these two utility calculations are weighted the same. And the reason is Stern wants to represent future generations in this discussion of climate change because he thinks that they have been very underrepresented and there's no reason for their welfare to not be counted just as much as the welfare of current people. In his utilitarian framework, he also calculates collective utility through an unweighted sum of individual welfare. So he doesn't give weight to people's different external circumstances or their individual social welfare functions. He also says that in both intra and intergenerational contexts, rich nations have more obligation to shoulder the abatement costs that climate change requires. So the issues with these normative assumptions is firstly, his utilitarian framework fails to respect individual rights. This is often true for utilitarianism in general. And in the case of climate change, his solution violates the rights of current generations. He overlooks the ways in which incredibly disadvantaged people now might be disproportionately affected by very, very high abatement costs. For example, cutting consumption might harm the revenue of certain firms which can have sort of negative spillover effects to people across the globe. Second issue is that, and this comes from Kelman's critique of cost-benefit analyses, is that climate change and sort of quantifying economic damage in the way that Stern does degrades intrinsic ecological value. The idea that Kelman proposes is that when we assign sort of any monetary value to something, it degrades the nature, the sort of intrinsic importance. And the same goes for the environment. Perhaps there is some intrinsic ecological value that we should be acknowledging instead of sort of putting it in this very anthropocentric framework. So as such, Stern's utilitarian framework is riddled with these normative issues, and he fails to sufficiently address and provide ethical justification for these things. On the other hand, Nordhaus sort of takes a more conservative, efficiency-based approach to climate change. And importantly, Nordhaus is actually responding to Stern's approach, and he is trying to avoid the normative problems. And he does this by adopting a higher discount rate that is equal to the real rate of return of capital at 6%. So the normative assumptions that he makes is he endorses the Pareto principle as sort of the metric of efficiency. And he basically says that a nation's self-interest includes caring if other countries are no worse. Therefore, in adopting a high discount rate, countries who engage in international negotiations will be incentivized to find global Pareto improvements. And implicitly, his framework, given the very high discount rate, also assumes that the welfare of current generations is more important than future generations. He says that, the sort of theoretical approach that Stern uses is too hypothetical, and we don't actually have the evidence to support that this will be the case. So he definitely puts more importance on what we're doing in the status quo. The issues with Nordhaus's approach is that, one, he endorses a moralized notion of a country's self-interest. It's very possible that nations actually don't care if other countries are worse off. They may just care about their own domestic interests. Secondly, another issue is that Nordhaus's approach reduces the importance of future welfare considerations. This is also an ethical assumption because why shouldn't we value the welfare of future generations the same as current generations? There's a certain level of justification that needs to go into this as well. So even though Nordhaus emphasizes the rational and efficiency-based justification for his framework, he still makes these normative claims. His efficiency-based approach is still subject to the same criticisms, albeit they're different in content, but they're still based on these ethical problems that come in both of these solutions. So as such, how do we sort of reconcile this issue of normativity, right? Robbins sort of says that economists should not engage in any sort of normative reasoning because that's not their expertise. However, I say that economists should make recommendations, even if it does involve normative claims for the case of climate change. Because given the nature of climate change, it's very difficult and undesirable, actually, to avoid normative assumptions. However, the key to the solution is that while they can make recommendations with normative claims and assumptions, they have to explicitly state what these sort of axioms or these arguments are, and they also have to acknowledge the analytical limitations of their moral reasoning. So they can say that they endorse this specific framework that is very ethical in nature, or very based off of heavy moral reasoning. But they also have to say that I'm an economist and I am just using this as part of my economic framework. And I think the value of this solution is that it enhances the depth and rigor of climate discussions. Climate change is such a huge issue with great risk and uncertainty. And I think by incorporating and integrating normativity into these discussions, economists can help elucidate the very complex economic implications in trade-offs, thereby making the discussion more meaningful and perhaps actually more effective in the long run. Thank you.